In 1979, a female police officer from a quiet coastal town in Northern California vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine night patrol, leaving behind only her empty squad car and a radio filled with static. But 16 years later, when marine archaeologists discovered something shocking wedged deep beneath the jagged rocks of Devil's Point, the mystery that had haunted an entire community would finally begin to unravel. Daniel Thompson sat in his weathered recliner on this foggy Tuesday morning, the steam from his coffee curling upward like the ghosts of cases that still visited him in his sleep. At 67, retirement had been kinder to his body than his mind. The old detective's fingers, once steady enough to dust for prints in the smallest crevices, now trembled slightly as he reached for the morning newspaper. But it wasn't arthritis that made his hand shake today. The phone call had come at dawn, jolting him from dreams filled with patrol cars and unanswered radio calls. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Marine Archaeological Institute had introduced herself with the kind of professional courtesy that barely masked excitement. She had found something, she said. Something that belonged to Officer Catherine Sullivan. Kate Sullivan. Even 16 years later, her name still hit Daniel like a physical blow. He could picture her as clearly as if she'd walked through his door yesterday. 26 years old, auburn hair always pulled back in a regulation bun, green eyes that sparkled with determination and just a hint of mischief. She had been the first female officer hire by the Crescent Bay Police Department, and Daniel had been her training supervisor. The morning Kate disappeared, October 13th, 1979, had started like any other. Daniel remembered standing in the station's break room, watching her check her equipment with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. Her badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, freshly polished as always. She had made a joke about Friday, the 13th falling on a Saturday, laughing at her own superstition while double-checking that her radio was working properly. That radio. God, how many times had Daniel replayed those final transmissions in his mind? Kate's voice, calm and professional, reporting a routine traffic stop on Highway 1, just north of the lighthouse. Then static. Then silence that had stretched across 16 years. Daniel set down his coffee cup and rubbed his eyes, trying to push away the familiar weight of guilt that had settled on his chest like morning fog. As Kate's supervisor, he should have insisted on backup. Should have checked on her when she didn't respond to the dispatcher's calls. Should have found her car sooner than the next morning. Parked perfectly at the scenic overlook with the driver's door hanging open like a question mark against the dawn sky. The official investigation had lasted 8 months. They had searched every cave, every tide pool, every inch of coastline between Crescent Bay and the Oregon border. They had interviewed her boyfriend, her landlord, every person she had pulled over in the weeks before her disappearance. They had dragged the harbor, brought in search dogs, even consulted a psychic that Kate's mother had found in San Francisco. Nothing. It was as if Officer Catherine Sullivan had simply stepped out of her patrol car and vanished into the Pacific fog. Dr. Rodriguez had been careful not to reveal too much over the phone, but her voice carried the weight of discovery. She had been conducting a coastal erosion study at Devil's Point, that treacherous stretch of cliff where the Pacific threw itself against the rocks with endless fury. Using new deep water scanning equipment, she had found something metallic wedged in a crevice 30 feet below the waterline, something that bore the seal of the Crescent Bay Police Department. Daniel pushed himself up from his chair, his knees protesting after too many years of chasing leads down dark alleys. He moved to the window and gazed out at the gray October morning. Crescent Bay looked exactly as it had 16 years ago. The same weathered Victorian houses perched on the hillside, the same fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, the same lighthouse standing sentinel over the rocky coastline. But underneath that familiar surface, Daniel knew secrets had been festering like barnacles on a sunken hull. Kate's disappearance had divided the small community. Some believed she had simply chosen to start a new life somewhere else, unable to handle the pressure of being the only female officer in a department that hadn't exactly welcomed her with open arms. Others whispered darker theories about what might have happened to a young woman alone on a deserted stretch of highway in the middle of the night. Daniel had never stopped believing that Kate Sullivan had been murdered. The evidence was circumstantial, built more on instinct than facts, but his gut had rarely steered him wrong during his 30 years in law enforcement. Kate wasn't the type to abandon her responsibilities or run away from challenges. She had fought too hard to earn her badge to throw it away on a whim. The fog outside his window began to lift, revealing glimpses of Devil's Point in the distance. Those black rocks had claimed dozens of ships over the past century, their jagged edges hidden beneath deceptively calm waters. Local fishermen called it a cursed place, where the ocean hoarded its secrets in underwater caves that no human eye had ever seen. Until now. Until Dr. Elena Rodriguez and her sophisticated equipment had pierced the darkness 30 feet below the surface and found something that had been waiting 16 years to tell its story. Daniel reached for his jacket, his pulse quickening with the familiar mixture of dread and anticipation that had defined his career. He had promised Kate's mother, before she passed away 5 years ago, that he would never stop looking for answers. Today, finally, he might be able to keep that promise. The drive to the Marine Archaeological Institute would take 40 minutes through winding coastal roads. 40 minutes to prepare himself for whatever Dr. Rodriguez had pulled from the depths. 40 minutes to steel himself for the possibility that his worst fears about Kate Sullivan's fate were about to be confirmed. As Daniel stepped into the gray morning air, he felt the weight of 16 years pressing down on his shoulders. But for the first time since that terrible October night in 1979, he also felt something else stirring in his chest. Hope. The Marine Archaeological Institute sat perched on the bluffs overlooking Monterey Bay, its modern glass structure a stark contrast to the weathered coastal landscape. Daniel pulled into the visitor parking lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to calm his racing heart. Through the salt-stained windows of the building, he could see sophisticated equipment and research stations where scientists worked to unlock the ocean's mysteries. Dr. Elena Rodriguez met him in the lobby, a woman in her early 40s with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her handshake was firm, her manner professional yet gentle, as if she understood the emotional weight of what she was about to show him. She led him through corridors lined with charts of ocean currents and photographs of underwater excavations. The building hummed with the quiet efficiency of serious research, a world away from the gritty police stations where Daniel had spent most of his career. They passed laboratories where technicians examined coral samples and marine artifacts, their work illuminated by bright fluorescent lights that reminded Daniel uncomfortably of the morgue. Dr. Rodriguez's office overlooked the bay, where research vessels moved slowly across the gray water like pieces on a chessboard. She gestured for Daniel to sit in a chair facing her desk, then opened a file folder with the careful precision of someone handling fragile evidence. The first item she showed him was a photograph, printed on high-quality paper that captured every detail in stark clarity. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. There, encrusted with barnacles and dulled by 16 years underwater, was Kate Sullivan's service weapon. The distinctive grip modifications that Kate had made herself were still visible beneath the marine growth. Dr. Rodriguez explained that her team had been conducting a comprehensive survey of Devil's Point as part of a coastal erosion study. The new deep water scanning technology they were using could penetrate areas that had never been accessible to traditional diving equipment. What they had discovered was a narrow crevice in the cliff face, 30 feet below the surface, where strong currents had deposited debris over the decades. The gun had been wedged deep in the rock formation, held in place by years of sediment and marine growth. But it wasn't alone. Dr. Rodriguez showed Daniel additional photographs, fragments of a police radio, its plastic housing cracked and colonized by sea anemones. A section of duty belt, the leather preserved by the cold salt water. Most disturbing of all, a piece of fabric that matched the dark blue of a police uniform. Daniel studied each photograph with the trained eye of an investigator, but his professional detachment was crumbling with every image. These weren't just pieces of equipment lost in an accident. The way they were clustered together, wedged deep in that underwater crevice, suggested they had all entered the water at the same time in the same location. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, her voice gentle but direct. Her preliminary assessment was that these items had been in the water for approximately 15 to 16 years, consistent with Kate's disappearance. The location where they were found was directly below Devil's Point, about 2 miles north of where Kate's patrol car had been discovered that morning in 1979. The ocean currents in that area were complex and unpredictable, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Items that entered the water near the lighthouse could easily be carried north by underwater currents and deposited in the crevice below Devil's Point. The rocky formations there acted like a natural trap, collecting debris that would otherwise be swept out to sea. Daniel asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the phone call. Had they found any human remains? Dr. Rodriguez shook her head slowly. The search was ongoing, but the underwater terrain was treacherous and the crevice extended deep into the cliff face. Her team would need specialized equipment and experienced technical divers to explore the deeper sections safely. As Daniel stared at the photographs spread across the desk, a cold certainty settled in his chest. Kate Sullivan hadn't simply vanished into the fog that night. She had gone into the water at Devil's Point, and someone wanted the world to believe it had been an accident. The question that would haunt his remaining years was beginning to form. Who had wanted Officer Catherine Sullivan dead, and why? Daniel drove back to Crescent Bay in a fog thicker than any coastal mist. The photographs Dr. Rodriguez had shown him were burned into his memory, each image a piece of a puzzle that had haunted him for 16 years. Kate's service weapon, her radio, fragments of her uniform, all resting 30 feet beneath the Pacific where no casual search would ever find them. The implications were staggering. Someone had known exactly where to dispose of evidence. Someone familiar with the treacherous currents around Devil's Point. Someone who understood that the underwater crevices would hide secrets for decades. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was calculated, methodical murder. Daniel pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner, a weathered establishment that had served the Crescent Bay community for over 40 years. The same red vinyl booths, the same checkered linoleum floor, the same smell of coffee and bacon grease that had greeted him and Kate during their countless meal breaks when she was still a rookie learning the ropes. Margaret Murphy, now in her 70s but still manning the register, looked up as the bell chimed his entrance. Her face brightened with recognition, then clouded with concern as she noticed his expression. She had known Daniel long enough to read the signs when a case was eating at him. Margaret led him to his usual booth in the back corner, the one that offered a clear view of the entire dining room. Old habits died hard in law enforcement. She poured coffee without being asked, her weathered hands steady despite her age. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, just a few local fishermen grabbing coffee before heading to the harbor. Daniel spread the photographs Dr. Rodriguez had given him across the table, studying them under the harsh fluorescent light. The barnacle-encrusted gun looked like something from a shipwreck, a relic of tragedy preserved by the cold depths. He tried to imagine the sequence of events that would lead to Kate's equipment ending up in that underwater crevice. Margaret returned with a slice of apple pie he hadn't ordered, her eyes drawn to the photographs. She had been working the night shift 16 years ago when word spread through town that Kate Sullivan was missing. Margaret had served Kate coffee just hours before she disappeared, remembered her laughing at something on the radio while she grabbed a quick dinner before starting her patrol. The older woman's voice dropped to a whisper as she asked if these were pictures of what they had found. Daniel nodded, watching Margaret's face pale as she recognized the implications. Everyone in Crescent Bay had wondered what happened to their first female police officer. Now they had their answer. It was worse than anyone had imagined. Margaret settled into the booth across from him, her voice barely audible above the hum of the coffee machine. She had always suspected that Kate's disappearance wasn't voluntary. The young officer had been excited about her job, determined to prove herself in a department that hadn't exactly rolled out the welcome mat for a woman. Kate had confided in Margaret about some of the challenges she faced, the subtle undermining from colleagues who resented her presence. Daniel's coffee grew cold as Margaret shared memories he had never heard before. Kate had mentioned feeling watched during her patrols, particularly on the isolated stretches of Highway 1. She had reported strange incidents to the department, times when she felt someone was following her patrol car, always staying just far enough back to avoid detection. The most disturbing revelation came when Margaret described Kate's last visit to the diner. The young officer had seemed nervous, distracted, constantly checking her watch and glancing toward the parking lot. She had asked Margaret if she had noticed anyone asking questions about her schedule, her patrol routes, her personal life. Margaret had assumed it was just the paranoia that came with police work, the occupational hazard of seeing danger everywhere. Now, sitting across from photographs of Kate's waterlogged equipment, those concerns took on a sinister new meaning. Someone had been watching Kate Sullivan. Someone had been learning her patterns, tracking her movements, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. And that someone was still out there, 16 years later, believing they had committed the perfect crime. Daniel left Murphy's diner with Margaret's revelations burning in his mind like acid. The afternoon fog was rolling in from the Pacific, shrouding Crescent Bay in the kind of gray mist that made everything seem uncertain, dreamlike. He drove through the familiar streets of his hometown, seeing them now through the lens of suspicion that had defined his career. The Crescent Bay Police Department sat on Main Street like a small fortress, its brick facade unchanged since the day he had first walked through those doors as a rookie officer 35 years ago. The American flag hung limp in the still air, and Daniel could see patrol cars parked in the lot behind the building, their white and blue paint schemes a stark reminder of the vehicle Kate had been driving the night she died. Chief Patricia Hendricks met him in the lobby, her expression carefully neutral. She had been a sergeant when Kate disappeared, one of the few officers who had treated the young woman with respect and professionalism. Now, at 53, she carried the weight of leadership in a department that had never fully recovered from the scandal of losing one of their own. Chief Hendricks led Daniel to her office, the same room where her predecessor, Chief William Crawford, had overseen the original investigation. The walls were lined with commendations and photographs of police graduations, but Daniel's eyes were drawn to a framed picture of Kate Sullivan in her dress uniform, taken just weeks after she completed the academy. Daniel spread Dr. Rodriguez's photographs across the chief's desk, watching Hendricks' face as she processed what she was seeing. Her poker face was excellent, but Daniel caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible pause before she spoke. These were the reactions of someone who had suspected the truth for a very long time. Chief Hendricks confirmed what Daniel already knew. The evidence was compelling, and the department would need to officially reopen Kate Sullivan's case as a homicide investigation. She would contact the county sheriff's department for assistance, given the potential conflict of interest in investigating one of their own cases. But as they discussed the logistics of the investigation, Daniel sensed something else beneath the chief's professional demeanor. A reluctance, perhaps even fear, that went beyond the normal challenges of reopening a cold case. When he pressed her about the original investigation, about why certain leads hadn't been pursued more aggressively, Hendricks became evasive. The conversation took a troubling turn when Daniel mentioned Margaret's revelations about Kate feeling watched and followed. Chief Hendricks' reaction was immediate and telling. She quickly dismissed these concerns as paranoia, suggesting that Kate had been under significant stress as the department's first female officer. Daniel found this response puzzling. Patricia Hendricks had always been Kate's strongest supporter within the department. Why would she now minimize concerns that could be crucial to solving her murder, unless those concerns pointed toward someone Hendricks was trying to protect? The retired detective's suspicions deepened when he asked to review the original case files. Hendricks explained that many of the documents had been transferred to county storage years ago, and it would take time to retrieve them. Some files, she admitted with visible discomfort, had been damaged in a basement flood 3 years after Kate's disappearance. As Daniel prepared to leave, Chief Hendricks made an unexpected request. She asked him to keep the discovery of Kate's equipment confidential until the official investigation could be launched. The last thing the department needed, she explained, was media attention that could compromise their ability to pursue leads. But Daniel sensed a different motivation behind her request. Someone in the Crescent Bay Police Department knew more about Kate Sullivan's death than they had ever revealed, and that someone might still be wearing a badge. Walking back to his car through the thickening fog, Daniel felt the familiar weight of corruption settling around him like a shroud. He had spent 30 years in law enforcement, long enough to recognize the signs when an institution was protecting itself rather than seeking justice. Kate Sullivan had been murdered by someone who knew her patrol patterns, someone familiar with the treacherous waters around Devil's Point, someone with enough authority to ensure that certain questions were never asked during the original investigation. The killer wasn't just still out there. The killer might still be on the force. That evening, Daniel sat in his study, surrounded by boxes of personal files he had kept from his years on the force. Despite Chief Hinder's claims about damaged records, he had maintained his own unofficial archive of cases that had never sat right with him. Kate Sullivan's disappearance was prominently featured among them. The lamplight cast long shadows across newspaper clippings, witness statements, and photographs as Daniel reconstructed the timeline of October 13, 1979. He had reviewed these materials countless times over the years, but now he examined them through the lens of murder rather than disappearance. Kate's last radio transmission had come 11:47 p.m., reporting a routine traffic stop on Highway 1 near mile marker 23. The dispatcher had tried to reach her again at 12:15 a.m., then every 15 minutes thereafter. When she failed to respond by 1:30 a.m., dispatch had sent backup to her last known location. What had always troubled Daniel was the 4-hour gap between Kate's missed radio check and the discovery of her patrol car. Standard protocol required immediate response when an officer failed to check in, yet the official report showed that backup wasn't dispatched until nearly dawn. Someone had delayed the search, giving Kate's killer precious hours to dispose of evidence and establish an alibi. Daniel pulled out a hand-drawn map he had created years ago, marking every location mentioned in witness statements. Mrs. Eleanor Voss, who lived in a cottage near the lighthouse, had reported seeing Kate's patrol car parked at the scenic overlook around midnight. But she had also seen another vehicle, a dark sedan, parked further down the access road with its lights off. The sedan's description had never made it into the official reports. Daniel remembered interviewing Mrs. Voss personally, taking detailed notes about the vehicle she had observed. When he later checked the case file, those notes had mysteriously disappeared. The elderly woman had been listed as unreliable due to her age and poor eyesight. Another witness, a night fisherman named Bobby Torino, had reported seeing unusual activity near Devil's Point around 2 a.m. He described flashlight beams moving along the cliff edge and what sounded like something heavy being thrown into the water. Torino's statement had also vanished from the official file, and when Daniel tried to re-interview him months later, the man had moved away from Crescent Bay without leaving a forwarding address. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone with access to police files had systematically removed or discredited evidence that pointed toward foul play. The same someone who had ensured that the search for Kate was delayed long enough for her killer to clean up the crime scene. Daniel's phone rang, jarring him from his review of the files. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. It was distorted, electronically altered, but the message was crystal clear. The voice warned him to stop digging into the past. Some secrets were buried for good reason, and disturbing them would only bring pain to innocent people. Kate Sullivan was dead, and nothing Daniel did would bring her back. But continuing his investigation might result in more graves being filled. The line went dead before Daniel could respond. He sat in his study, surrounded by the evidence of corruption and cover-up, feeling the weight of 16 years pressing down on him like the ocean depths that had hidden Kate's equipment. Someone was watching him now, just as they had watched Kate all those years ago. Someone who knew he had discovered the truth and was willing to kill again to protect their secret. But this time, Daniel Thompson wouldn't be caught off guard. This time, he would be ready for them. Daniel spent a sleepless night checking locks and peering through curtains, the threatening phone call echoing in his mind. By dawn, he had made a decision that went against every instinct developed during 30 years of following proper procedures. He couldn't trust the Crescent Bay Police Department, and he couldn't wait for an official investigation that might be sabotaged from within. He drove to the public library when it opened at 9 a.m., seeking answers in the one place where records couldn't be mysteriously damaged or disappeared. The Crescent Bay Gazette had been documenting local events since 1923, and their archives were meticulously preserved on microfilm. Librarian Helen Foster, a woman who had known Daniel since his rookie days, helped him navigate the newspaper archives. She remembered the intense media coverage of Kate's disappearance, how the story had dominated local headlines for months before gradually fading into occasional anniversary pieces. Daniel scrolled through October 1979 editions, studying not just the articles about Kate, but the broader context of what was happening in Crescent Bay during that period. What he discovered painted a disturbing picture of a community in transition, where old power structures were being challenged, and some people had very good reasons to resist change. The newspaper revealed that Kate's hiring had been controversial from the beginning. Several town council meetings had featured heated debates about whether a woman should be carrying a gun and patrolling alone at night. The opposition hadn't just come from conservative residents. It had also included vocal criticism from within the police department itself. One particularly revealing article quoted then Sheriff William Crawford expressing concerns about the experimental nature of hiring female officers. Crawford had argued that women lacked the physical strength and emotional stability required for law enforcement, especially in a coastal community where officers often worked alone for hours. More troubling was an article from September 1979, just 1 month before Kate's disappearance, detailing a sexual harassment complaint she had filed against a fellow officer. The complaint had been quickly dismissed by Chief Robert Harrison, Kate's supervisor at the time, who suggested that the young woman had misinterpreted friendly workplace banter. Daniel's hands trembled as he read the details of the harassment complaint. The accused officer was Deputy Sheriff Frank Morrison, Crawford's right-hand man, and the person responsible for coordinating the search efforts when Kate disappeared. Morrison had allegedly made inappropriate comments about Kate's body, suggested that she should find a safer profession like teaching or nursing, and had even followed her into the women's locker room on multiple occasions. The pieces were beginning to form a horrifying picture. Kate hadn't just been the victim of random violence. She had been systematically targeted by someone who resented her presence on the force. Someone who had the authority to delay search efforts, manipulate evidence, and ensure that inconvenient witnesses disappeared. Helen Foster brought Daniel a cup of coffee as he continued reading, her face grave with understanding. She had worked at the library during Kate's era and remembered the whispered conversations that never made it into the newspaper. There had been rumors about Kate planning to file additional complaints, possibly even a lawsuit against the department for creating a hostile work environment. The most chilling revelation came in an article from November 1979, published 3 weeks after Kate's disappearance. Sheriff Crawford had announced the promotion of Deputy Frank Morrison to the position of detective, praising his dedicated service and outstanding performance during the recent search operations. Morrison had been rewarded for his role in Kate's disappearance, elevated to a position where he could better influence investigations and protect himself from scrutiny. The man who had harassed and threatened Kate Sullivan was now in charge of investigating her case. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of institutional corruption settling around him like fog. Kate hadn't just been murdered. She had been silenced by a system that valued its own protection over justice for a young woman who dared to challenge the status quo. But Sheriff Crawford was retired now, living quietly in a cabin near the state forest. And Detective Frank Morrison, despite his promotion, would have left behind traces of his crimes that 16 years couldn't erase. Daniel's investigation took a dangerous turn when he decided to track down Frank Morrison. The former detective had retired 5 years ago after a 30-year career that had somehow avoided any serious scrutiny despite Kate's case remaining unsolved. Public records showed Morrison living in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Crescent Bay, where he apparently spent his retirement fishing and maintaining a workshop. Driving past Morrison's property on Elm Creek Road, Daniel noted the man's meticulous attention to detail. The yard was perfectly maintained, tools organized with military precision in the garage, and a small boat trailer that suggested frequent trips to the coast. It was the home of someone who planned carefully and left nothing to chance. Daniel parked down the road and observed Morrison's routine for 2 days. The man followed a predictable schedule: morning coffee on the porch, afternoon trips to the hardware store or marina, evening walks along the creek that bordered his property. Morrison appeared to be living the quiet life of a retiree, but Daniel noticed details that suggested otherwise. The former detective constantly checked his surroundings, positioning himself where he could observe approaching vehicles. His workshop windows were covered with heavy curtains, and Daniel caught glimpses of what appeared to be sophisticated radio equipment inside. Most telling of all, Morrison made daily drives along Highway 1, always taking the same route that passed both the lighthouse and Devil's Point. On the third day, Daniel's surveillance was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Sheriff William Crawford's pickup truck pulled into Morrison's driveway, and Daniel watched through binoculars as the two men embraced like old friends. They spent over an hour in Morrison's workshop, their conversation animated and occasionally heated. When Crawford finally left, Morrison immediately went inside and made several phone calls. Daniel could see him pacing in front of the kitchen window, his body language suggesting stress and agitation. Whatever Crawford had told him, it had disturbed Morrison's carefully maintained equilibrium. That evening, Daniel received another anonymous phone call. The same electronically distorted voice, but this time the threat was more specific. The caller knew where Daniel lived, where he bought his groceries, where he had coffee every morning. They knew about his visits to the Marine Archaeological Institute and his research at the library. If he continued his investigation, they would ensure he joined Kate Sullivan at the bottom of the Pacific. But this time, Daniel was ready. He had installed a recording device on his phone line, and he had taken photographs of Crawford's visit to Morrison's house. More importantly, he had contacted an old friend from his days with the state police, Detective Captain Maria Santos, who now worked with the Attorney General's office investigating police corruption. Santos had been intrigued by Daniel's information about evidence tampering and witness intimidation. She agreed to quietly initiate a preliminary investigation, using resources outside the local jurisdiction that Crawford and Morrison couldn't influence. Santos understood that they were dealing with a conspiracy that went to the very top of the Crescent Bay law enforcement community. The breakthrough came when Daniel decided to take a calculated risk. Instead of continuing passive surveillance, he approached Morrison directly. On a foggy Thursday afternoon, he knocked on the former detective's door, introducing himself as a retired officer interested in discussing Kate Sullivan's case. Morrison's reaction was immediate and telling. The man's face went pale, and his hands began shaking visibly. He claimed to barely remember Kate, describing her disappearance as a tragedy that had affected the entire department. But his nervous demeanor contradicted his casual words. When Daniel mentioned the discovery of Kate's equipment at Devil's Point, Morrison's facade cracked completely. He demanded to know who had told Daniel about the underwater search, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. The slip was revealing. Morrison knew about the equipment discovery, even though that information hadn't been released to anyone outside the investigation. Daniel pressed further, mentioning witness statements about suspicious activity near Devil's Point on the night Kate disappeared. Morrison's response was swift and vicious. He accused Daniel of harassment and threatened to call the police if he didn't leave immediately. But as Daniel walked back to his car, he noticed Morrison's hands were still shaking. The man who had terrorized Kate Sullivan 16 years ago was now terrified himself, realizing that his perfect crime was finally unraveling. The confrontation with Morrison had rattled both men, but it also provided Daniel with the confirmation he needed. The former detective's knowledge of details that hadn't been publicly released could only mean one thing. Frank Morrison was intimately involved in Kate Sullivan's murder. Now, Daniel needed proof that would stand up in court. Detective Captain Maria Santos arrived in Crescent Bay the following Monday, traveling under the cover of a routine administrative review. She met Daniel at a coffee shop in the next town over, well away from prying eyes and local gossip networks. Santos was a woman in her late 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of direct manner that had earned her respect throughout the state police system. Santos had already begun preliminary background checks on both Morrison and Crawford. What she discovered painted a disturbing picture of corruption that extended far beyond Kate's murder. Morrison's financial records showed regular cash deposits that couldn't be explained by his police salary, suggesting possible involvement in drug trafficking or protection rackets that operated along the isolated coastal highways. More damning was Crawford's connection to a series of evidence tampering cases that had resulted in several drug dealers walking free during the 1980s. The pattern suggested a systematic corruption of the local justice system, with Crawford and Morrison at the center of a conspiracy that used their badges to protect criminal enterprises. Santos explained that Kate Sullivan's murder might have been motivated by more than just personal animosity. As a conscientious officer, Kate would have eventually discovered the corruption within her department. Her harassment complaint against Morrison wasn't just about inappropriate behavior. It was a threat to an entire criminal operation that depended on police protection. The two investigators spent hours reviewing Daniel's evidence, building a timeline that connected Morrison's harassment of Kate to her murder and the subsequent cover-up. Santos was particularly interested in the witness statements that had disappeared from official files, especially the testimony about the dark sedan scene near the lighthouse on the night Kate died. Santos had brought sophisticated recording equipment and surveillance technology that Daniel could never have accessed as a civilian. They developed a plan to gather the proof they needed by drawing Morrison and Crawford into admissions of guilt. The strategy would be dangerous, requiring Daniel to put himself at risk as bait. That evening, Daniel made a phone call to Morrison, using his home line that he knew was likely being monitored. He claimed to have found additional evidence at Devil's Point, items that Dr. Rodriguez's team had missed during their initial search. Daniel suggested that they should meet to discuss what he had discovered, implying that he might be willing to keep quiet about certain details in exchange for Morrison's cooperation. Morrison's response was immediate and predictable. He demanded to know exactly what Daniel had found, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. When Daniel refused to provide details over the phone, Morrison agreed to meet him at the scenic overlook near the lighthouse, the same location where Kate's patrol car had been found 16 years ago. The meeting was set for midnight, a time that would provide cover for whatever Morrison was planning. Daniel understood the risk he was taking. Morrison had killed once to protect his secrets, and he wouldn't hesitate to kill again if he felt cornered. But Santos would be positioned nearby, with recording equipment and backup from State Police Unit stationed just outside Crescent Bay. This time, Morrison wouldn't have the luxury of a corrupted local investigation to cover his tracks. As Daniel prepared for what might be his final confrontation with Kate Sullivan's killer, he thought about the young woman who had died because she dared to challenge a corrupt system. Tomorrow night, 16 years after her murder, Kate would finally get the justice she deserved. The trap was set. Now, they just had to spring it without getting killed in the process. The lighthouse beam swept across the dark Pacific as Daniel arrived at the scenic overlook just before midnight. The same location where Kate Sullivan's empty patrol car had been discovered 16 years ago now felt heavy with the weight of unfinished business. Daniel parked his car facing the ocean, positioning himself where Santos and her backup team could maintain visual contact from their concealed positions. Morrison arrived 10 minutes late, his headlights cutting through the coastal fog as he pulled into the gravel parking area. He had chosen to drive his personal vehicle rather than the pickup truck Daniel had observed during surveillance, suggesting he was already thinking about disposal and alibis. The former detective approached Daniel's car cautiously, his right hand resting near his waistband where Daniel suspected he carried a concealed weapon. Morrison's paranoia was evident in every movement, constantly scanning the darkness for threats while maintaining the pretense of a casual conversation between retired law enforcement officers. Daniel stepped out of his vehicle, the recording device Santos had provided hidden beneath his jacket. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below Devil's Point provided natural cover for their conversation, but also served as a reminder of where Kate's equipment had been discovered. Morrison wasted no time with pleasantries. He demanded to know exactly what Daniel had found during his alleged return to Devil's Point, his voice tight with the kind of fear that 16 years of successful cover-up couldn't quite suppress. Daniel played his role carefully, describing fictional evidence that he claimed would prove Kate Sullivan had been murdered. The reaction was immediate and telling. Morrison's face went pale in the moonlight, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. He began asking specific questions about underwater currents and tidal patterns that only someone familiar with disposing of evidence in the ocean would know to ask. When Daniel mentioned the possibility of finding Kate's remains in the deeper crevices below Devil's Point, Morrison made his first crucial mistake. He described details about the underwater terrain that could only have been learned through personal experience, including the location of specific rock formations that would trap debris. Daniel pressed further, suggesting that modern forensic techniques might be able to extract DNA evidence from items that had been underwater for 16 years. Morrison's control finally snapped completely. He grabbed Daniel by the jacket, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he explained that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The confession came in fragments, driven by Morrison's desperation to gauge how much Daniel actually knew. He admitted to following Kate's patrol car that night, to confronting her about her harassment complaints and threats to file additional charges. He described her resistance, her attempt to use her radio to call for backup, the struggle that ended with her service weapon discharging harmlessly into the air. Morrison claimed the killing had been accidental, the result of a physical altercation that went too far. But his detailed knowledge of how to dispose of evidence suggested otherwise. He described weighing down Kate's body with chains and rocks, using his knowledge of ocean currents to ensure it would never be found. The most chilling revelation came when Morrison explained how he had manipulated the investigation. As the detective assigned to Kate's case, he had systematically removed witness statements, delayed search efforts, and intimidated anyone who might contradict the official narrative of voluntary disappearance. Daniel kept Morrison talking, drawing out details that would be crucial for prosecution, while Santos recorded every word from her position among the trees. The former detective was so focused on determining what evidence existed against him that he failed to notice the careful questioning technique Daniel was using to elicit admissions of guilt. The confrontation reached its climax when Morrison realized he had said too much. His hand moved toward his concealed weapon as he stepped closer to Daniel, the same predatory positioning he had likely used with Kate 16 years ago. But this time, the victim was ready. And this time, justice was listening. Morrison's hand was halfway to his weapon when the night exploded with light and sound. Santos and her backup team emerged from their concealed positions, flashlight beams converging on the former detective as state police officers surrounded the overlook with weapons drawn. The confrontation that had been building for 16 years ended not with violence, but with Morrison's complete breakdown. Faced with overwhelming evidence and caught in the act of threatening Daniel, the man who had terrorized Kate Sullivan collapsed to his knees on the gravel, his carefully maintained facade crumbling like the coastal cliffs under relentless waves. Santos stepped forward, her badge gleaming in the flashlight beams as she read Morrison his rights. The recording device had captured everything: his detailed knowledge of the crime scene, his admission of following Kate that night, his description of disposing of her body in the waters below Devil's Point. But Morrison wasn't finished talking. Perhaps sensing that his decades of successful deception were finally over, he began providing details that went far beyond Kate's murder. Through tears and broken sentences, he described a corruption network that had operated within the Crescent Bay Police Department for over 20 years. Sheriff Crawford had been the architect of the operation, using his position to protect drug smugglers who used the isolated coastal highways to transport their cargo. Morrison had been his enforcer, eliminating threats and ensuring that inconvenient evidence disappeared from official files. Kate Sullivan's murder had been just one of several violent acts committed to protect their criminal enterprise. The confession revealed that Kate had stumbled onto evidence of drug money being laundered through local businesses. Her harassment complaint had been a secondary concern. The real threat was her accidental discovery of financial records that would have exposed the entire operation. Morrison had been ordered to silence her permanently, making it look like she had simply chosen to disappear. Santos immediately radioed for additional units to arrest Crawford before he could flee or destroy evidence. The elderly former sheriff was taken into custody at his cabin near the state forest, where investigators found detailed financial records and correspondence that documented decades of criminal activity. As dawn broke over Crescent Bay, the town awakened to news that would shake its foundation. The police officers they had trusted to protect them had been the very criminals they needed protection from. The young woman whose disappearance had haunted the community for 16 years had been murdered by the man assigned to investigate her case. Daniel stood at the edge of the cliff where Kate's equipment had been discovered, watching as Coast Guard divers prepared to begin a comprehensive search of the underwater caves below Devil's Point. Morrison's confession had provided specific details about where Kate's body had been disposed of, weighted down with chains, and hidden in crevices that had kept her secrets for 16 years. Dr. Rodriguez arrived with her archaeological team, bringing sophisticated underwater scanning equipment that would map every inch of the rocky formations below. The same technology that had discovered Kate's equipment would now be used to bring her home for proper burial. Margaret Murphy from the diner appeared with coffee and sandwiches for the investigators, her elderly hands shaking as she tried to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. She spoke quietly about Kate's courage, about how the young officer had died trying to expose corruption that had poisoned their community for decades. As the investigation continued throughout the morning, Daniel felt a mixture of satisfaction and profound sadness. Justice for Kate Sullivan was finally within reach, but it had come at the cost of revealing how thoroughly their institutions had been corrupted. The truth that Kate had died seeking was finally coming to light, illuminating the darkness that had hidden beneath Crescent Bay's peaceful surface for far too long. 3 days after Morrison's arrest, Dr. Rodriguez's team made the discovery that Daniel had both hoped for and dreaded. Using advanced sonar mapping and remotely operated vehicles, they located human remains in a deep crevice 40 feet below Devil's Point, exactly where Morrison's confession had indicated they would be found. The recovery operation required specialized technical divers and equipment capable of working in the treacherous underwater terrain. Daniel watched from the surface as the Coast Guard team carefully extracted what remained of Officer Catherine Sullivan after 16 years beneath the Pacific. The chains Morrison had described were still wrapped around the skeletal remains, a brutal reminder of the calculated nature of her murder. DNA testing would take several weeks to provide official confirmation, but the forensic evidence was overwhelming. The remains were consistent with a woman of Kate's age and height, and fragments of police uniform fabric still clung to the bones. Most conclusively, Kate's police academy ring was still on her finger, the metal preserved by the cold salt water that had become her grave. The discovery sent shockwaves through the state law enforcement community. Attorney General Patricia Williams arrived in Crescent Bay to personally oversee the expansion of the corruption investigation. Williams announced that a special task force would review every case handled by Crawford and Morrison during their careers, looking for additional victims of their criminal conspiracy. Morrison, facing charges of first-degree murder, attempted to negotiate a plea agreement by providing information about other crimes. His lawyers claimed he had been coerced by Crawford and other senior officers, portraying him as a reluctant participant rather than an enthusiastic enforcer. But the evidence painted a different picture of a man who had used his badge to terrorize and ultimately murder a young woman whose only crime was doing her job with integrity. Crawford's arrest had revealed the extent of the corruption network. Financial records found in his cabin documented payments from drug trafficking organizations, kickbacks from protection rackets, and systematic theft from police evidence rooms. The elderly former sheriff had amassed a fortune through decades of criminal activity, all while maintaining the facade of a respected law enforcement officer. The preliminary hearing for Morrison's murder charge took place in the Monterey County Courthouse, moved from Crescent Bay to ensure an impartial proceeding. Daniel testified about his investigation and the events leading to Morrison's confession, his voice steady as he described 16 years of seeking justice for a murdered colleague. Margaret Murphy testified about Kate's fears in her final weeks, describing the young officer's concerns about being followed and her plans to file additional harassment complaints. Her testimony painted a picture of a woman under increasing pressure from colleagues who saw her as a threat to their criminal activities. Dr. Rodriguez provided scientific testimony about the underwater discovery, explaining how the ocean currents and rocky formations had preserved evidence that would otherwise have been lost. Her team's meticulous documentation of the recovery site would be crucial in establishing the chain of evidence needed for prosecution. The most dramatic moment came when Chief Patricia Hendricks took the witness stand. Under oath, she admitted to suspecting corruption within the department, but failing to act on those suspicions. Her testimony revealed the institutional culture that had allowed Crawford and Morrison to operate with impunity for decades. Hendricks described receiving pressure from Crawford to limit the scope of Kate's investigation, to accept the theory of voluntary disappearance despite evidence suggesting otherwise. She admitted to her own cowardice in not challenging senior officers who had the power to end her career. As the hearing concluded, Daniel felt a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. Kate Sullivan was finally getting her day in court, but it had taken 16 years and the courage of one retired detective to bring her killers to justice. 6 months after Frank Morrison's conviction for the first-degree murder of Officer Catherine Sullivan, Daniel Thompson stood in the Crescent Bay Memorial Cemetery as Kate was finally laid to rest with full police honors. Representatives from law enforcement agencies across California had come to pay their respects to a fallen officer whose courage had ultimately exposed decades of corruption. The cemetery overlooked the Pacific Ocean where Kate had been held prisoner for 16 years. Now, surrounded by family members who had never stopped believing in her, she rested peacefully in soil rather than salt water, her sacrifice acknowledged and her memory honored. Morrison had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his final appeal rejected by the state Supreme Court. The evidence against him had been overwhelming. His recorded confession, the physical evidence recovered from Devil's Point, and testimony from multiple witnesses who described his harassment and threats against Kate. Sheriff William Crawford had also received a life sentence, though his advanced age meant he would likely die in prison long before completing his term. The corruption investigation had uncovered evidence of at least 12 other murders connected to their criminal network, including the deaths of 2 informants and a federal drug enforcement agent who had gotten too close to their operation. The systemic reform of the Crescent Bay Police Department had been swift and comprehensive. Chief Patricia Hendricks had resigned in disgrace, replaced by an outside administrator who implemented new oversight procedures and transparency requirements. Every officer who had served during Crawford's tenure was subjected to intensive background investigation, resulting in additional arrests and forced retirements. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had continued her marine archaeological work, but her discovery of Kate's equipment had fundamentally changed her research focus. She now worked with law enforcement agencies to develop underwater recovery techniques for cold cases, using the ocean's preservation properties to solve crimes that had seemed impossible to crack. Daniel had been awarded a commendation from the Attorney General's office for his role in exposing the corruption network. More importantly to him, he had fulfilled the promise he made to Kate's mother years ago. Justice had finally been served, even if it had taken longer than anyone had hoped. Margaret Murphy had lived to see Kate's killers brought to justice, passing away peacefully just 2 months after Morrison's conviction. In her final weeks, she had spoken often about Kate's courage and determination, describing the young officer as a hero who had died fighting for what was right. The impact of Kate's case extended far beyond Crescent Bay. The Attorney General's office had used lessons learned from the investigation to identify corruption in other small coastal departments, leading to reforms that would protect future officers from the institutional failures that had cost Kate her life. As Daniel walked away from the cemetery after the burial service, he reflected on the 16-year journey that had finally brought Kate home. The coastal fog was beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of Devil's Point in the distance. Those treacherous rocks no longer held their secrets, and the waters that had hidden Kate's remains now sparkled peacefully in the afternoon sunlight. Kate Sullivan had been silenced by corruption and murdered by cowards, but her death had ultimately served a purpose greater than her killers could have imagined. Her courage in challenging a corrupt system had inspired the investigation that brought down an entire criminal network, ensuring that future officers will be protected by the transparency and accountability that her sacrifice had made possible. In death, Officer Catherine Sullivan had finally won the fight for justice that had cost her everything in life.